The first time my son handed me a rent invoice, I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I genuinely thought he was joking. He placed the paper on my kitchen table, right beside the coffee cup my husband had used every morning for 30 years, and said, "Mom, starting next month, you'll need to pay $700. I looked at the paper, then at him. Pay who? He sighed like I was deliberately being difficult. Me. For the house. For a few seconds, I couldn't speak. This was the house I had bought with my husband before he passed away. Every wall held a memory. The hallway still had the pencil marks where we had measured our son's height as a child. The kitchen cabinets had been chosen together. I had spent decades paying the mortgage, the taxes, the repairs, and every unexpected expense that came with owning a home. And now my own son was standing in front of me, asking me to pay rent. I reminded him that the house belonged to me. He didn't argue. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and said, "I know, Mom. But things are different now." Different. That word stayed with me long after he left the kitchen. 8 months earlier, I had welcomed my son, Daniel, his wife, Melissa, and their 2 children into my home after he lost his job. He told me he only needed somewhere to stay temporarily while he got back on his feet. I never hesitated. He was my son. I gave them the upstairs bedrooms and moved some of my things into the smaller guest room. I told myself the noise would be good for me after years of living alone. For a while, it was. But slowly, Daniel began acting as though moving into my house had somehow made him the owner of it. He started deciding which bills should be paid, which repairs were necessary, and what parts of the house we could use. Then one evening, he told me that because he was handling everything, I needed to start contributing financially. I told him I already contributed. I paid the property taxes, the insurance, the utilities, the repairs. He simply shook his head. "You don't understand, Mom. I'm trying to make this place work." Then he pushed the invoice toward me. I stared at my son's handwriting across the top. Monthly rent, $700. And for the first time, I wondered if letting my son into my home had been the biggest mistake I had ever made. At first, I told myself the rent invoice was the worst thing Daniel had done. I was wrong. The invoice was only the beginning. A few days after he handed it to me, Daniel came home carrying a folder. He placed it on the dining table and told me we needed to get some things organized. I asked what things. "House stuff," he said. "Nothing complicated." He opened the folder and pulled out several pages. He explained that because I was getting older and because he was now living in the house, it would be easier if he helped manage the property. He said there were insurance forms, utility authorizations, and documents that would allow him to handle things if I ever became sick or couldn't deal with them myself. It sounded reasonable. That was what frightened me later. Because Daniel knew exactly how to make something dangerous sound like something loving. He pointed to each page and told me where to sign. Whenever I stopped to read something, he would say, "It's standard, Mom. Everyone does this." I trusted him. He was my son. So I signed. I didn't know that one of those documents gave him far more authority than I had ever intended to give him. After that, his behavior changed. He began referring to the house as if it were something we both controlled. When the kitchen faucet started leaking, he told me he would decide when it needed to be repaired. When I wanted to replace an old refrigerator, he told me not to spend money without discussing it with him first. Then he started keeping paperwork in a locked drawer in the office. One afternoon, I asked him for the property insurance documents because I needed them for my records. He looked at me and said, "I've got everything under control." I reminded him that it was my house. His expression hardened. "Mom, that's exactly why I'm trying to help. You don't understand how expensive everything is." But I understood. I had owned that house for 32 years. I knew exactly what the taxes cost. I knew the insurance payments. I knew how much the utilities were. And most importantly, I knew that I had never needed to charge myself rent to live there. Yet Daniel kept insisting that my $700 monthly payment was necessary. Then he began calling it my share. That word bothered me. My share of my own house. I started looking at the paperwork more carefully. One evening, after Daniel had gone upstairs, I opened the folder he had left on the table. I read every page slowly this time. And halfway through, I found a phrase that made my stomach tighten. Daniel had not simply been helping me manage household expenses. He had been given authority to act on certain financial matters involving the property. I read the sentence again. Then again. I suddenly remembered the way he had rushed me through the paperwork. The way he had said, "Just sign here, Mom." The way he had never once suggested that I have someone else review it. For the first time, I wondered whether the rent invoice was not about helping with expenses at all. Maybe it was about making me believe that Daniel had a right to control the house. And if that was true, I needed to find out exactly what my son had been doing behind my back. I closed the folder, put it back exactly where I had found it, and said nothing. Daniel thought I was still the trusting mother who would sign whatever he placed in front of me. He had no idea that I had finally started paying attention. The first real clue came from the bank statement. I had been looking through my monthly expenses when I noticed something that didn't make sense. The $700 I had been paying Daniel was supposed to cover my share of the household expenses, but the numbers weren't adding up. The electricity bill was the same. The water bill was the same. The property insurance had already been paid for the year. Even the grocery expenses hadn't changed enough to justify another $700 every month. So I called the utility company myself. Nothing had changed. I checked the insurance account next. Paid. Then I looked at the property tax records. That was when I became uncomfortable. Daniel had told me he was handling everything because he was trying to protect the house from unexpected expenses. But the property taxes were still in my name, and I couldn't find any record showing that he had made the payments he claimed he was making. I went back through the rent checks I had written. $700. $700. $700. Nearly $3,000 had already gone to my son. I suddenly wanted to know where it had gone. The next morning, I went to the bank and asked for copies of my recent statements. I didn't tell the teller that I suspected my son. I simply said I was reviewing my finances. When I looked at the statements, I found several transfers that I didn't recognize. One payment had gone to a company I had never heard of. Another had been transferred into an account that wasn't in my name. Then I noticed something even more disturbing. The dates of some of those transfers were only days after Daniel had asked me to sign the paperwork. My hands went cold. I called Daniel that evening and asked him about the payments. He didn't hesitate. "Those are house expenses," he said. "What house expenses?" He became irritated. "Mom, I already told you. I'm handling everything." I asked him to show me the receipts. There was a long silence. Then he said, "Why are you suddenly questioning everything I do?" That question told me more than his answer could have. I wasn't suddenly questioning everything. I was finally questioning him. I told him I wanted copies of every bill he had paid with my money. He said he didn't have time. I told him I would wait. He slammed his hand against the counter and accused me of treating him like a thief. I didn't respond. Because by then, I wasn't wondering whether he was hiding something anymore. I was wondering how much he had hidden. That night, I called the bank again and asked whether there had been any recent financial activity connected to my property. The woman on the phone paused. Then she asked me a question that made my heart stop. "Ma'am, are you aware of a loan application associated with your home?" I sat completely still. "What loan application?" She wouldn't give me details over the phone. She told me I needed to come into the branch with identification. I hung up and stared at the kitchen table where Daniel had first placed that ridiculous rent invoice. Suddenly, the $700 wasn't the biggest problem. My son hadn't simply been charging me rent. He had been using my home for something else. And I was determined to find out exactly what. The next morning, I went to the bank before Daniel even woke up. I carried my identification, the property documents, and every rent check I had written since he moved in. I didn't know exactly what I was going to find, but I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was normal. A bank employee named Mrs. Carter took me into a private office. I explained what had happened and showed her the documents Daniel had given me. She looked through them carefully. Then she pulled up something on her computer. Her expression changed. "Ma'am, there's a home equity application associated with this property." I felt my stomach drop. "How much?" She hesitated. $48,000. I stared at her. "That isn't possible." She turned the screen toward me. There it was. My address. My name. And a signature that was supposed to be mine. I had never applied for that loan. I asked her who had submitted it. She couldn't give me everything, but she told me that someone had acted under the authority of a document giving them permission to handle my financial affairs. I immediately knew what she meant. The paperwork Daniel had rushed me through. The documents I had signed because I trusted my own son. Mrs. Carter asked whether I had personally appeared before a notary when I signed the authorization. "No," I said. She looked at me carefully. "Are you certain?" "Yes." She printed a copy and placed it in front of me. There was a notary stamp on the page. But something was wrong. The name and commission information didn't match the state's public registry. Mrs. Carter made another call. Then she came back and told me that the bank was opening a fraud review. I felt something inside me shift. For weeks, Daniel had made me feel as though I was unreasonable for questioning him. Now the bank was telling me there was a serious problem. I asked where the $48,000 had gone. She couldn't disclose everything while the investigation was active, but she showed me enough transaction information to understand what was happening. A large portion had been transferred shortly after the loan was funded. It hadn't gone toward my property. It hadn't gone toward taxes. It hadn't gone toward repairs. It had gone into an account connected to Daniel. I sat there staring at the paper. Suddenly, the rent made sense. The paperwork made sense. His insistence that he was protecting my house made sense. He wasn't protecting me. He was using the house. I left the bank with copies of everything and called an attorney that afternoon. When I told him what had happened, he didn't tell me to confront Daniel. He told me to stay calm. "Do not sign anything else," he said. "And don't tell him what we know until we've reviewed everything." For the first time, I understood that this wasn't simply a family argument. My son had crossed a line. And now his own paperwork was about to become the evidence that brought his entire lie down. The attorney told me that once we had enough evidence, I would have to make a decision I never imagined making about my own son. I could either keep protecting him because he was my child, or I could finally protect myself. For the first time in months, I chose myself. The bank confirmed that the loan had been opened using an authorization that was now under investigation. The money had been transferred away from my property, and the rent Daniel had been collecting had never been used for the expenses he claimed. The attorney helped me send formal notices and secure every document connected to the house. Daniel knew something was wrong when he came home one afternoon and found me sitting at the kitchen table with a folder in front of me. He looked at the papers. Then he looked at me. "Mom, what's going on?" I pushed the folder toward him. "You tell me." He opened it. I watched his face change as he read the bank records. For once, he didn't have an immediate answer. I asked him why he had taken the loan. He said he was desperate. He said he had planned to pay everything back. Then he said something that hurt more than anything else. I knew you wouldn't understand. I looked at him and said, you didn't need me to understand. You needed me to agree. And you knew I wouldn't. He lowered his eyes. The rent was another thing he tried to explain away. He said it was supposed to help him get stable. I reminded him that he had never told me that. He had simply created an invoice and expected his own mother to obey it. By the end of the conversation, he finally admitted that he had convinced himself the house would eventually belong to him anyway. That sentence broke something inside me. Not because I hadn't suspected it. Because hearing my son say it aloud made me realize how differently he had started seeing me. Not as his mother. Not as the woman who had raised him. But as an obstacle standing between him and a house he believed he was entitled to. I told him he and his wife would have to leave. He begged me to reconsider. He promised he would fix everything. But I had heard promises before. This time, I needed actions. They moved out several weeks later. The bank ultimately canceled the fraudulent loan after completing its investigation, and the attorney helped make sure the property remained protected. I stopped paying rent to my own son. I changed the locks. And for the first time in months, I walked through my house without wondering what someone had done behind my back. The house was quiet again. But this time, the quiet felt different. It didn't feel empty. It felt safe. Daniel still calls occasionally. We're not enemies. But we're not the same either. I learned that loving your child doesn't mean allowing them to destroy your boundaries. Sometimes the hardest thing a mother can say is also the most necessary. I love you, but you no longer get to use my love against me. And when I sat alone in the kitchen that evening, looking at the old table where that first rent invoice had landed, I realized something. My son thought he had turned me into a tenant in my own home. Instead, his own lie had forced me to finally take back what was mine.